They sat across the mahogany table in a silent boardroom. He was the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, the man on the cover of Forbes. She was just the quiet, boring housewife he had outgrown. When Grant Sterling pushed the divorce papers across the table, he smirked, thinking he had stripped her of everything. He thought she would beg. He thought she would cry. Instead, Clara signed her name without a trembling hand, stood up, and disappeared into the rain. Grant thought he had won. But 3 weeks later, on a private runway in Monaco, the engines of a Gulfstream G650 roared to life. And when the door opened, Grant Sterling realized he hadn't just divorced his wife. He had divorced the most powerful woman in the room. This is the story of how she signed quietly and destroyed him loudly. The scratching of the fountain pen against the heavy bond paper was the only sound in the room. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the law firm Pendleton & Moore, the Manhattan skyline was weeping a grey drizzle, obscuring the view of the Empire State Building. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Grant Sterling sat with his legs crossed, the sharp crease of his navy Brioni suit catching the dim light. He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe Nautilus that cost more than the house Clara grew up in, and sighed audibly. He was bored. This was a transaction to him no different than selling off a non-performing asset or closing a subsidiary that was bleeding cash. Across from him sat Clara. She wore a beige cardigan that had seen better days and a simple grey skirt. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, practical bun. She looked exactly like what she had been for the last 7 years, the invisible wife. The woman who made the coffee, who remembered his mother's birthday, who ironed his shirts before he could afford a maid, and who stayed home while he conquered the world of fintech. "We need a signature on page 14. Mrs. Sterling," Arthur Pendleton Grant's lawyer said. His voice was dripping with faux sympathy, the kind rich lawyers reserve for women they are about to make destitute. "This clause confirms that you are waiving your right to spousal support in exchange for the lump sum settlement of $50,000. $50,000 for 7 years of marriage. It was an insult. It was less than Grant spent on bottle service at One Oak in a single weekend. Grant leaned forward, his eyes cold. "Clara, look. I'm trying to be fair here. The prenup was ironclad. You get what you came in with, which was essentially nothing. The 50 grand is a kindness, a severance package. Take it, buy yourself a nice little apartment in Queens, and start over." Clara didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on the paper. She didn't scream that she had proofread his business plans when he was a nobody. She didn't mention that it was her idea to pivot Sterling Dynamics into AI trading, a move that made him a billionaire. She didn't mention the late nights she spent soothing his panic attacks when the board wanted to fire him in 2019. She just picked up the pen. "Is this the final copy?" Clara asked. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper. "It is," Arthur said, sliding a check across the table. "Once you sign, the marriage is dissolved. You will vacate the penthouse by noon tomorrow." Clara signed. Clara A. Sterling. She capped the pen and placed it gently on the table. Then she reached into her purse, pulled out her wedding ring, a modest 1-carat diamond from before Grant was rich, and set it on top of the papers. "I don't want the check," Clara said, pushing the $50,000 back toward Grant. Grant laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Don't be a martyr, Clara. You need to amass the money. You have no job, no degree that's relevant, and no connections. Don't let your pride starve you." "I don't want your money, Grant," she repeated, standing up. She smoothed down her skirt. I just want to be free. Grant rolled his eyes, pocketing the check. Suit yourself. More for the new decor. He didn't even stand up to shake her hand. He was already texting on his phone, likely messaging Tiffany Lacroix, the 23-year-old Instagram model he had been seen with for the past 6 months. Clara walked to the heavy oak door. She paused for a fraction of a second, her hand on the brass handle. "Goodbye, Grant," she said. "I hope the view from the top is everything you imagined." "It is," Grant muttered, not looking up. "Close the door on your way out." Clara stepped into the hallway, walked past the reception desk where the secretaries looked at her with pity, and stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, hiding the world of Grant Sterling from her view, slump in her shoulders vanished. She straightened her spine. The shy, timid look in her eyes evaporated, replaced by a gaze of cold, tempered steel. She pulled a burner phone from her pocket and dialed a number she hadn't called in 7 years. "It's done," Clara said into the phone. Her voice was no longer soft. It was commanding with a clipped, aristocratic accent she had spent years hiding. "I'm out. Send the car." "Confirmed, madame," a deep voice replied instantly. "The jet is fueled at Teterboro. We are heading to Zurich or directly to the summit." "The summit," Clara said. "It's time everyone remembered who Clara von Habsburg actually is." 3 weeks had passed since the divorce was finalized. Grant Sterling was on top of the world, or at least he felt like he was. The media had barely covered the divorce. Clara was so uninteresting that the tabloids didn't care, and he was free to parade Tiffany Lacroix around Manhattan. Tiffany was everything Clara wasn't. She was loud, she glittered, and she demanded attention. She wore Balenciaga to breakfast and live-streamed their dates. Grant loved it. It validated his status. He wasn't just a tech nerd anymore. He was a mogul. Grant sat in his office overlooking Central Park, swirling a glass of Macallan 25. His assistant, a nervous young man named David, knocked on the door. "Sir." The mail came in. "There's something specific you need to see." "Just put it on the desk, David," Grant snapped. "It's an invitation, sir, to the Ethelgard Summit." Grant froze. He set his glass down. The Ethelgard Summit wasn't just a business conference. It was the gathering. It happened once every 2 years at a secluded location. It was where the real owners of the world met the Rothschilds, the heads of state, the shadow investors who controlled the central banks, and the tech titans who actually mattered. Grant had been trying to get an invitation for 5 years. He had been rejected every single time. He snatched the thick black envelope from David's hand. It was made of velvet-textured paper, embossed with real gold leaf. "Mr. Grant Sterling, you are cordially invited to the 2026 Ethelgard Summit. Location, Château de Saint-Cloud, Monaco. Dress code, white tie." "I'm in," Grant whispered, a grin spreading across his face. "I'm finally in the big leagues." He immediately called Tiffany. "Pack your bags, babe. We're going to Monaco. And buy the most expensive dress you can find. We're going to be in a room with people who make Elon Musk look like a pauper." The flight to Monaco was a party. Grant took his private bombardier jet, drinking champagne with Tiffany and his VP of Operations, Marcus Thorne. "You know why they invited me, right?" Grant bragged, loosening his tie. "They know Sterling Dynamics is about to acquire Omni Systems. Once I take over Omni, I'll control 40% of the global transaction processing market. They need me. It's going to be a bloodbath for the competition." Marcus agreed, laughing. "By the way, did you hear anything from Clara?" Did she cash the check? I told you she didn't take it. Grant scoffed. She's probably living in some studio apartment in Jersey clipping coupons. Honestly, it's better this way. She wouldn't fit in at Ethelgard. Can you imagine Clara in a room with royalty? She'd probably try to fix their hems or offer them homemade cookies. It would be embarrassing. Tiffany giggled, scrolling through her phone. She sounds tragic, Grant. Totally tragic. They landed in Nice and took a helicopter to Monaco. The air smelled of sea salt and old money. The Ethelgard summit was being held at a private estate on the cliffs, accessible only by a single, heavily guarded road or by air. When Grant's limousine pulled up to the entrance that evening, the paparazzi were kept a mile away. This was strictly private. Security was tighter than the G7. Grant stepped out of the car, adjusting his tuxedo. Tiffany was wearing a sheer diamond-encrusted gown that left very little to the imagination. It was flashy, perhaps a bit too flashy for this crowd, but Grant didn't care. He wanted to show her off. They walked up the grand staircase into the ballroom. It was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers the size of cars hung from the ceiling. A live orchestra played softly in the corner. And the people. There was the Prime Minister of the UK. There was the CEO of Saudi Aramco. There was Caleb Blackwood, the reclusive billionaire who owned half of the real estate in London and New York. "Keep it cool," Grant whispered to Tiffany. "We belong here." He grabbed a glass of champagne and began to work the room. He managed to shake hands with a few European banking CEOs, but the reception was chilly. They were polite but distant. They looked at Tiffany's dress with slight amusement, then turned back to their conversations. Grant felt a prickle of irritation. They still see me as new money, he thought. Just wait until I close the Omni deal. Suddenly the music stopped. The heavy double doors at the top of the grand staircase, which had remained closed all night, began to open slowly. A hush fell over the room. Even the Prime Minister stopped talking. "Who's that?" Tiffany whispered, chewing her gum. "The Queen or something." "There is no Queen of France, Tiffany," Grant hissed. "Be quiet." Grant looked up. He expected a head of state, maybe the President of the United States. Instead, a woman stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the ballroom. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged her figure like a second skin, flowing down into a train that shimmered like the night sky. Around her neck sat a necklace that Grant recognized from a history book, the Romanov sapphires. It was a piece of jewelry worth more than the entire capitalization of Sterling Dynamics. Her hair was no longer in a bun. It fell in cascading, glossy waves around her shoulders. Her makeup was sharp, accentuating high cheekbones and eyes that scanned the room with predatory confidence. Grant squinted. The woman looked familiar. The curve of the jaw, the way she held her head. But it couldn't be. The woman began to descend the stairs. She didn't walk. She glided. And on her arm, escorting her with a look of absolute reverence, was Caleb Blackwood, the man Grant had been trying to get a meeting with for 3 years, the man who never took meetings. Caleb was looking at this woman, not like a date, but like a subordinate looks at a boss. The room erupted in whispers. "It's her," someone near Grant said in a hushed tone. "The silent partner." "I thought she was in exile," another replied. "If she's back, the market is going to crash." Grant felt the blood drain from his face. His knees went weak. As the woman reached the bottom of the stairs, she turned. Her eyes locked onto Grant's across the crowded room. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She just stared right through him. It was Clara. But it wasn't the Clara who made casseroles. It wasn't the Clara who wore beige cardigans. This was Clara von Habsburg-Wellingham, the sole heiress to the Wellingham Trust, the shadow entity that financed half the technological infrastructure of the Western world. "No," Grant whispered, his glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the marble floor. That's my wife." A man standing next to Grant, a senior partner at Goldman Sachs, turned and looked at him with a sneer. "Your wife." The banker laughed, shaking his head. "Mr. Sterling, you are mistaken. That is Lady Clara Wellingham. She owns the bank that loaned you the money to start your company. And if the rumors are true, she's here to call in the debt." The sound of Grant's glass shattering seemed to echo endlessly in the silent ballroom. Waiters rushed over to sweep up the shards of crystal, but Grant didn't move. He stood, frozen, his eyes fixed on the woman standing at the foot of the grand staircase. "Grant, what is wrong with you?" Tiffany hissed, tugging on his sleeve. "People are staring. And who is that woman? Why is she wearing that necklace? It looks like something from a museum." "Shut up, Tiffany," Grant murmured, his voice trembling. He pushed past her, stepping over the broken glass. He had to be sure. It had to be a hallucination. Maybe the stress of the Omni Systems deal was getting to him. Maybe he had too much scotch on the jet. Clara was a mouse. She was a woman who bought her clothes at outlet malls and clipped coupons for laundry detergent. She wasn't this. He began to walk toward her. The crowd parted for Clara as she moved through the room. She held a champagne flute with a grace that suggested she had been born holding one. Caleb Blackwood, the billionaire property tycoon, known for being the most ruthless negotiator in London, was leaning in, whispering something in her ear that made her offer a small, polite smile. "Clara," Grant called out. The sound of his voice was too loud for the refined atmosphere of the chateau. Several heads turned. A few eyebrows were raised. Clara didn't stop. She didn't even flinch. She continued walking toward the terrace doors, Caleb at her side. Grant quickened his pace. He reached out to grab her arm. "Clara, wait a damn min." Before his fingers could even graze the velvet of her sleeve, a hand clamped onto his shoulder. It felt like a vice. Grant spun around. He was face to face with a man who looked less like a bodyguard and more like a special forces operative. The man wore a tuxedo, but the earpiece and the dead look in his eyes gave him away. "Mr. Sterling," the guard said quietly, "please maintain a respectful distance from Lady Wellingham." "Lady who?" Grant sputtered. "That's my wife. Get your hands off me." "Ex-wife," a cool voice said. Grant froze. The guard stepped back. Clara had turned around. Up close, the transformation was even more terrifying. The Clara he knew had warm, anxious eyes that were always seeking his approval. This woman's eyes were like glaciers, beautiful, ancient, and utterly indifferent. "Hello, Grant," she said. Her tone was conversational, polite. It was the tone one uses with a distant acquaintance they haven't seen in years. "Clara, what is this?" Grant gestured wildly at her dress, the necklace, the room. "What are you doing here? How did you get in? Are you sleeping with Blackwood?" The room went deadly silent. Caleb Blackwood stepped forward, his face darkening with rage. He opened his mouth to eviscerate Grant, but Clara held up a single manicured hand to stop him. "It is fascinating," Clara said, tilting her head slightly. "Even now, Your mind immediately goes to the lowest common denominator. You assume that for a woman to be in a room of power, she must be on her back. "Don't play games with me." Grant snapped, his face reddening as he realized the elite of the business world were watching. "You're a housewife, Clara. You're here on someone's arm. I just want to know whose, so I know who I'm dealing with." Clara took a slow sip of her champagne. "You are dealing with me, Grant. And you are right. I was a housewife. I was your housewife. I played the role because I wanted a simple life. I wanted to be loved for Clara, not for the Wellingham Trust." She took a step closer to him. The scent of her perfume hit him, a rare custom blend of jasmine and oud that he suddenly remembered smelling on her years ago before they were married, before she stopped wearing it, because he said it was too strong. "But you didn't love Clara," she continued softly. "You loved the maid. You loved the assistant. You loved the safety I provided while you played at being a king." "I made us rich," Grant shouted. "I built Sterling Dynamics from nothing." Clara laughed. It was a dark, rich sound. "Grant," she said, pity in her eyes, "do you really think a bank like Sovereign Capital lends $2 million to a college dropout with a 600 credit score because of a good business plan? Do you think the SEC investigation in 2021 just went away by magic? Do you think your competitors dropped their lawsuits against you out of the kindness of their hearts?" Grant's mouth opened, but no words came out. "I paved every inch of that road for you," Clara said. "I made the calls. I signed the guarantees. I silenced the enemies. I let you think you were the genius because I wanted you to feel proud. But you mistook my support for weakness, and you mistook my silence for stupidity." She turned to Caleb. "I'm bored of this, Caleb. Shall we discuss the lithium acquisition in Bolivia? I hear the minister is waiting for us." "Of course, Clara," Caleb said, shooting Grant a look of pure disdain. "Wait." Tiffany had finally caught up, breathless and teetering on her heels. She looked at Clara, then at Grant. "Grant, tell her to leave. She's embarrassing us." Clara stopped. She looked at Tiffany. She didn't look angry. She looked at Tiffany the way a human looks at a particularly noisy chihuahua. "You must be the new model," Clara said. "Tiffany, is it?" "Yeah," Tiffany snapped, crossing her arms. "And I'm the future Mrs. Sterling." Clara smiled. "Well then, a piece of advice, Tiffany. Make sure you read page 14 of the prenup better than I did. Although without me backing his loans, I doubt there will be much left to split next time." Clara turned and walked away, the train of her midnight blue gown trailing behind her like a royal cape. Caleb Blackwood offered her his arm, and they disappeared onto the terrace. Grant stood alone in the center of the ballroom. He felt small. For the first time in his life, he realized that the room wasn't looking at him with envy. They were looking at him with the one thing a narcissist cannot handle: amusement. The next morning, the sun rose over the Mediterranean, turning the sea into a sheet of gold. Grant Sterling had not slept. He had spent the night in his suite pacing back and forth frantically, calling his lawyers and his CFO. "Find out who Wellingham is," he had screamed at his team at 300 a.m. "I don't care if it's a trust fund. Find out the connection." The answer had come back at 600 a.m. The Wellingham Trust, the email read, is a private family office based in Zurich. Estimated assets undisclosed, likely exceeding $50 billion. Primary beneficiary, Clara Alexandra von Habsburg Wellingham, granddaughter of the steel magnate Friedrich Wellingham. Grant sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the phone. He had been married to a $50 billion heiress, and he had given her $50,000 to go away. "It doesn't matter," he muttered to himself, splashing cold water on his face. "I still have the company. I still have the Omni Systems deal. Once I sign that acquisition today at noon, I'll be untouchable. I won't need her money." He dressed in his sharpest suit, a charcoal Tom Ford. He slicked back his hair. He put on his game face. He was Grant Sterling. He was a shark. He left Tiffany sleeping in the room she was hung over and complaining about the lack of room service options, and headed to the conference wing of the chateau. The meeting for the acquisition of Omni Systems was set for the library room. It was a massive wood-paneled space filled with antique books. Sitting at the long table were the executives of Omni Systems. Their CEO, a stern Frenchman named Luc Dubois, stood up and shook Grant's hand. "Mr. Sterling," Luc said, "we are ready to proceed. The merger agreement is prepared." "Excellent, Luc," Grant said, sitting down and opening his leather folder. "Let's get this done. I know you're eager to access our AI algorithms, and we're eager to expand our footprint in Europe. There is just one small procedural matter," Luc said, glancing at the door. "As you know, Omni Systems is privately held. The majority shareholder has final veto power over any acquisition. She insisted on being present for the final signature." Grant frowned. "I thought you were the majority shareholder, Luc." "I own 20%, Luc said. "The other 80% is held by a silent investment vehicle. They have been passive until now." The heavy oak doors opened. Grant didn't even have to look. He felt the temperature in the room drop. Clara walked in. She wasn't wearing a ball gown today. She was wearing a white power suit, impeccably tailored, sharp, and terrifyingly professional. Her hair was straight, framing her face like a helmet of war. She didn't look at Grant. She walked to the head of the table, the seat usually reserved for the chairman, and sat down. She opened a thin file folder. "Good morning, gentlemen," Clara said. "Clara," Grant said, his voice tight. "This is a business meeting. You can't just—" "Mr. Sterling," Luc interrupted. "Lady Wellingham owns 80% of Omni Systems. She is the chairwoman of the board." Grant felt like he had been punched in the gut. Of course she owned it. "Okay," Grant said, forcing a smile. "Okay, fine. This is business, right, Clara? It's a good deal. Sterling Dynamics is offering 40% above market value for your shares. You stand to make $1 billion on this deal alone. You're a businesswoman. You won't walk away from profit just because of personal history." Clara looked at him. She clasped her hands on the table. "You are correct, Grant. I am a businesswoman, which is why I have reviewed the financials of Sterling Dynamics myself." She pulled a sheet of paper from her folder and slid it down the table. "Your company is currently leveraged at 6-1. Clara stated, her voice cool and factual. "Your last 2 quarterly reports show a 20% decline in user retention. And most critically, your primary line of credit, the $300 million from sovereign capital that keeps your payroll afloat, is up for renewal next month." Grant sweated. "That's standard operational debt, and sovereign loves us. They'll renew." "Actually," Clara said, "they won't." She produced another document, a letter from Sovereign Capital. "I sit on the risk committee for Sovereign Capital," Clara said. "We met this morning, given the volatility in your personal life and the fact that you no longer have the spousal guarantor who secured your initial risk profile. The bank has decided to call in the loan." "You can't do that." Grant slammed his hand on the table. "You're doing this to spite me." I am doing this because you are a bad investment, Clara said calmly. Without that loan, Sterling Dynamics is insolvent within 90 days. Therefore, as the chair of Omni Systems, I cannot in good conscience approve a merger with a sinking ship. The deal is dead. Grant stood up, his chair clattering backward. You're ruining me. I built that company. You built a facade, Clara corrected him. And now the wind has changed. She closed her folder and stood up. However, she said, pausing, I am not unreasonable. I am willing to acquire Sterling Dynamics to save it from bankruptcy. Grant stared at her. You want to buy my company? I'm offering you 10 cents on the dollar, Clara said. It's enough to pay off your personal debts, enough to keep your penthouse for another year or two. But the condition is that you step down as CEO immediately. I'd rather burn it to the ground, Grant spat. That is also an option, Clara said, checking her watch. But I'd hurry if I were you. The news of the failed merger will hit the Bloomberg terminal in 3 minutes. Your stock is about to free fall. Grant pulled out his phone. He opened his trading app. As he watched, the ticker for Sterling Dynamics STRD flashed red. 5%, 12%, 20%. It was crashing. The market knew the deal was dead. Luke, Clara said, turning to the Frenchman, I believe we are finished here. Let's go get lunch. I'm craving truffle pasta. Yes, madame, Luke said. They walked out, leaving Grant standing alone in the library, watching his net worth evaporate in real time on a 5-inch screen. The flight back to New York was not a celebration. It was a funeral procession at 40,000 feet. Grant Sterling sat alone in the main cabin of his Gulfstream. The champagne was warm. The caviar was untouched. Across the aisle, Tiffany Lacroix was aggressively typing on her phone, her acrylic nails clicking against the screen like hail on a tin roof. She hadn't spoken to him since they left the chateau. Grant stared out the window at the Atlantic Ocean, a vast expanse of grey that matched his internal landscape. The Wi-Fi on the jet was spotty, but he had seen enough. The news was everywhere. Sterling Dynamics shares plunge. 60% after failed merger. SEC to investigate Sterling insider trading allegations. Who is Clara Wellingham, the mystery heiress who crushed a tech giant? His phone buzzed. It was another margin call from his broker. He turned it off. We need to talk, Tiffany said. She didn't look up from her phone. Grant rubbed his temples. Not now, Tiff. I have to figure out how to stop the bleeding when we land. I need you to be supportive. We're going to have to downsize for a bit. Maybe move to the Hamptons house while I sort out the penthouse situation. Tiffany finally looked at him. Her eyes were devoid of affection. They were calculating like a predator assessing a wounded animal. There is no we, Grant, she said flatly. I'm not going to the Hamptons. I'm going to LA. LA? What are you talking about? I'm done, she said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. Look, this was fun when you were the king of fintech. But now you're a liability. My engagement numbers are down just by being associated with you today. People are laughing at you, Grant. I can't build a brand on a loser. A loser? Grant stood up, his face flushing. I bought you that diamond necklace you're wearing. I paid for your apartment. I made you famous. You made me an accessory, she corrected. And now the accessory is returning itself. She reached behind her neck, unclasped the diamond necklace, a $20,000 piece he had bought her just last week, and dropped it onto the seat. Keep it. You're going to need the cash. When the jet landed at Teterboro, there was no limousine waiting. The car service account had been suspended for non-payment. Grant had to call an Uber. Tiffany didn't even wait for him. She hopped into a black SUV that was waiting for her on the tarmac. A car sent Grant noted with a sinking heart by a famous rapper she had claimed to just be friends with. Grant rode alone to Manhattan in the back of a Toyota Camry that smelled of stale pine air freshener. When he arrived at the penthouse, the sprawling 3-story glass box overlooking Central Park that symbolized his rise to power. The doorman, a man named Henry, who usually greeted him with a smile, looked at the floor. "Mr. Sterling," Henry mumbled. I'm sorry, sir." "It's fine, Henry. Just open the door." Grant snapped, swiping his key fob. The light didn't turn green. It flashed red. Access denied. "What is this?" Grant shook the door. "Henry, open the damn door." "I can't, sir," Henry said, his voice pained. "The building management received a notice of foreclosure an hour ago. The locks have been changed. The assets inside have been frozen by the bank pending the bankruptcy hearing. My clothes are in there." Grant screamed, his composure finally snapping. "My watch collection, my hard drives." "They'll be catalogued and auctioned, sir," Henry said gently. "I have a box here. The lawyers let me pack some essentials for you." He handed Grant a small cardboard box. Inside was a phone charger, a stick of deodorant, and a framed photo of Grant holding his first check. Grant stood on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue. It was raining again, just like the day Clara had signed the divorce papers. Passers-by were starting to recognize him. He saw a teenager point a phone at him, filming the downfall of the billionaire. Grant Sterling, the man who thought he ruled the world, had nowhere to go. He checked his pockets. He had his wallet. He had 2 credit cards. He walked to the nearest ATM and tried to withdraw $500. Transaction declined. He tried the second card. Transaction declined. He had forgotten. The joint accounts, the business accounts. Everything was tied to the credit lines that Clara's trust had guaranteed. When she pulled the plug, the entire grid went dark. He had exactly $40 in cash in his pocket. Grant walked 3 blocks to a dingy diner he used to scoff at. He ordered a black coffee and sat in the back booth, his wet designer suit clinging to his skin. He put his head in his hands. He thought of Clara, not the vindictive titan he saw in Monaco, but the Clara of 7 years ago, the Clara who sat on the floor of their first apartment, eating Chinese takeout with him, telling him that she believed in him when no one else did. "I made you," she had said in the ballroom. He realized now, with a terrifying clarity, that she was right. He hadn't built Sterling Dynamics. He had just been the face on the brochure. She had been the engine, the fuel, and the road, and he had thrown her away for a girl who just left him on a runway. A shadow fell over his table. Grant looked up, expecting the waitress. It wasn't. It was Arthur Pendleton, his lawyer, the man who had sneered at Clara during the divorce. Arthur looked disheveled. He slid into the booth opposite Grant. "We're screwed, Grant," Arthur said, loosening his tie. "The SEC is at my office right now. They're seizing files. They're asking about the shadow accounts, the offshore buffers we used to hide the losses in 2024. "Those were your idea," Grant hissed. "They were our idea," Arthur corrected. "And guess who has the paper trail, Clara? She sent a dossier to the Department of Justice this morning. She didn't just pull the funding grant. She handed them the smoking gun." "She's sending me to prison," Grant whispered. "No," Arthur said. "She's smarter than that. The dossier exonerates you from the fraud provided you plead incompetence. You have to admit, you didn't know what was happening with the money. You have to go on record saying you were just a figurehead, and that the CFO, who has already fled the country, acted alone. Admit I was a figurehead. Grant stared at him. That destroys my reputation. I'll never run a company again. It's that or 20 years in federal prison, Arthur said. She left you a way out, Grant, but the price is your ego. Grant looked at his reflection in the dark window of the diner. He looked old. He looked tired. She thought of everything, Grant murmured. She wants me alive, but stripped. She wants you to be what you were before you met her, Arthur said. Nothing. 6 months later. New York City was blooming into spring, but Grant Sterling felt like he was living in a perpetual winter. He lived in a studio apartment in Queens, now ironically not far from where he had told Clara to move. It was a walk-up. The radiator clanked. The view was a brick wall. He wasn't in prison. He had taken the deal. He had stood in front of a press conference and admitted that he was unaware of the financial irregularities at his own company. He had publicly branded himself an incompetent CEO. Sterling Dynamics had been dissolved, its assets bought for pennies by a holding company owned by, well, everyone knew who owned it. Grant worked as a consultant now, not for high-end fintech firms, but for small businesses trying to manage their payroll software. He made enough to pay rent and buy groceries. He took the subway. He had learned to be invisible. He wore a baseball cap and kept his head down. One Tuesday in May, he saw the flyer. The New York Botanical Garden Annual Gala. Guest of honor, Lady Clara Wellingham, for her contributions to sustainable agriculture. He shouldn't go. He knew that. He had no invitation, no money for a ticket, and certainly no right to be there. But the need to see her was a physical ache. Not to yell at her, not to beg for money. He just needed to see her face one more time, without the anger, without the shock. He needed to know if the woman he once loved was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the diamonds and the vengeance. He put on his one remaining good suit. It was a bit loose now. He had lost 20 pounds from stress and a diet of ramen noodles. He took the train to the Bronx. The garden was lit up like a fairyland. Security was tight, but Grant knew a back way in near the old stone mill, a spot he and Clara had discovered years ago, on a cheap date back when they used to explore the city for free entertainment. He climbed a low fence, tearing his trouser leg, and slipped into the shadows of the rose garden. He could hear the music and the clinking of glasses from the main tent. He walked toward it, staying in the darkness of the trees. And then he saw her. She wasn't in the tent. She had stepped out for air, standing near a fountain bathed in moonlight. She was wearing a simple silver gown, elegant and understated. She was alone. Grant stepped out from behind a weeping willow tree. A twig snapped under his foot. Clara turned. She didn't jump. She didn't call for security. She just watched him approach. "I wondered if you would come," she said. Her voice was soft, lacking the razor-sharp edge it had carried in Monaco. "You knew?" Grant asked, stopping 10 feet away. "I know everything, Grant. You know that now." Grant let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, I know that now." He looked at her. She looked peaceful. The tension that used to line her forehead when they were married, the constant worry of pleasing him, was gone. "I live in Queens," Grant said. "Astoria." "I know," Clara said. "I own the building." Grant's eyes widened. You're my landlord." "I bought the building 3 months ago," she said. "I instructed the management to lower your rent by 20%. I heard you were struggling." Grant felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know whether to be furious or grateful. Why? After everything, Why, because I don't hate you, Grant, Clara said, trailing her hand in the water of the fountain. Hate takes energy, and I needed all my energy to rebuild the life I sacrificed for you. I'm sorry, Grant said. The words came out strangled, rusty. He realized he hadn't said them in a decade. I'm sorry I didn't see you. I'm sorry I treated you like furniture. Clara looked at him, her eyes sad but dry. Thank you. I appreciate that. But it's too late for apologies to fix anything. I know, Grant said. I wanted to ask you one thing. The $50,000. The divorce settlement. Why didn't you just tell me who you were? Why did you let me humiliate you like that? Clara turned to face him fully. Because I needed to know, she said. I needed to know if there was any part of you that loved me. Not the connections, not the money, not the usefulness. Just Clara. If you had treated me with kindness during that divorce, if you had been fair, I would have stayed. I would have helped you fix the company. We could have ruled the world together, Grant. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. I gave you a test. I handed you a pen and a check, and I waited to see if you were a man or a monster. Grant looked down at his shoes, and I failed. Spectacularly, she whispered. The sound of applause erupted from the tent. Someone was calling her name on a microphone. I have to go, Clara said. She gathered her shawl. Clara, Grant said. Are you happy? She paused. She looked back at him, and for a second the moonlight caught a glimmer of the old Clara, the girl who loved him. I am free, Grant, she said, and for me, that is happiness enough. She walked away back toward the lights and the music and the world that belonged to her. Grant stood alone in the dark garden for a long time. Then he turned around, climbed back over the fence, and walked to the subway station. He had a consultation at 8:00 a.m. the next morning for a dry cleaner in Brooklyn. He couldn't be late. 1 year later. The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 a.m. It wasn't the soothing, gradual light awakening of a smart home system, nor was it a gentle nudge from a personal assistant. It was a harsh plastic rattle from a $10 clock bought at a pharmacy. Grant Sterling groaned, rolling off the twin mattress that took up most of the space in his fourth-floor walk-up in Astoria. His back ached, a persistent reminder of the 12-hour shifts he now pulled on his feet. He showered in a bathroom where the hot water lasted exactly 4 minutes, dressed in a black t-shirt and jeans, and tied on a green apron. He caught his reflection in the cracked medicine cabinet mirror. The lines around his eyes were deeper. The tan from his weekends in the Hamptons was long gone, replaced by the pallor of a man who worked indoors from dawn until dusk. But there was something else in his face, too. The manic, hungry desperation that had defined him for a decade was gone. He looked tired, yes. But for the first time in his life, he looked human. The morning air in Queens was crisp, smelling of exhaust and damp pavement. Grant walked the 6 blocks to The Grind, a small independent coffee shop on a busy corner. It wasn't much. The paint was peeling slightly near the ceiling, and the mismatched furniture was thrifted. But the espresso machine, a gleaming Italian La Marzocco, was top of the line. Grant knew because he had sold his Patek Philippe Nautilus, the last symbol of his former life, to pay for the repairs on it, when the previous owner wanted to give up. That sale had bought him a 30% stake in the business. He wasn't the CEO of a billion-dollar fintech giant anymore. He was the junior partner of a neighborhood cafe. "Morning, Grant," called out Mr. Henderson, an 80-year-old regular who was already waiting by the door. "Morning, Artie," Grant said, unlocking the door and flipping the sign to open. "Oat milk cappuccino extra hot, no foam." "You know it, kid." Grant got to work. His hands, once manicured and soft, were now rough, calloused from hot steam and sanitizer. He moved with a rhythm he had never possessed in the boardroom. Grind, tamp, pull, steam, pour. There was an honesty to it. In his old life, he sold promises and algorithms, things that didn't really exist. Here, he sold caffeine and warmth. If he made a mistake, he couldn't hide it in a spreadsheet. The customer would taste it. By 8:00 a.m., the rush was in full swing. The line snaked out the door. "Grant, we're out of almond milk," shouted Marco, the 19-year-old barista Grant had hired 2 months ago. Marco was terrified of messing up, constantly looking to Grant for reassurance. "Check the bottom fridge, Marco. If not, run to the bodega across the street. Take 20 from the till," Grant said calmly, handing a latte to a nurse in scrubs. A year ago, a supply chain issue would have made Grant scream at a VP. He would have fired someone. Now he just wiped the counter and kept moving. Around 9:30 a.m., the rush slowed down. The shop quieted to the hum of laptops and low conversation. The door chimes jingled, and a young woman walked in. She looked exhausted. She was carrying a stack of thick law textbooks that looked heavy enough to break her back. Her coat was frayed at the cuffs, and she was digging through a coin purse with frantic, trembling fingers. She approached the counter, counting out quarters and dimes. She came up short. She bit her lip, looking up at the menu board where a latte was listed at $5. She stammered, her face flushing red. "Actually, just a small drip coffee, please." "Black." Grant froze. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes. He saw the cheap, practical clothes. He saw the hunger not just for food, but for success, for a chance to prove herself. It was Clara. Not literally, of course. But it was the spirit of the woman he had married 10 years ago. He remembered Clara sitting on the floor of their first studio apartment, counting coupons so she could buy him a nice steak for his birthday. He remembered her staying up until 3:00 a.m., proofreading his pitch decks, never asking for credit, never asking for a share. He had taken that loyalty, used it as fuel for his own ego, and then discarded it when he thought he had outgrown it. Grant cleared his throat. He reached for a large cup. He didn't pour the drip coffee. He moved to the espresso machine. He ground fresh beans. He steamed the milk to velvety perfection, pouring a Rosetta pattern into the foam. He added a shot of vanilla, just the way Clara used to like it. He placed the large latte on the counter. "That'll be $5, the girl whispered, looking down. "I don't think I have enough." "It's on the house," Grant said. His voice was thick with emotion. The girl looked up, startled. "What? Why?" "You're studying for the bar exam, right?" Grant gestured to the books. "Yeah. Property law. It's killing me." "You're going to crush it," Grant said, sliding the cup toward her. "Just do me a favor." "Anything," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup like it was a lifeline. Grant leaned over the counter, his eyes intense. "When you make it, when you're sitting in the big office with the view and the assistants and the money, don't forget how the coffee tastes today, and don't forget the people who helped you get there." The girl blinked, sensing the weight behind his words. She nodded slowly. "I promise. Thank you." She walked to a table in the corner, opening her book. Grant watched her for a moment, then turned back to the sink to wash pitchers. "Hey, Grant, turn it up." Mr. Henderson was pointing at the flat-screen TV, mounted in the corner of the shop, usually tuned to a 24-hour news channel on mute. Grant grabbed the remote and turned the volume up slightly. "Breaking news from Paris," the anchor announced. "Lady Clara Wellingham, the reclusive philanthropist and businesswoman, has made a rare public appearance today." Grant stopped scrubbing. He walked to the end of the counter, drying his hands on his apron. On the screen, Clara was walking down the steps of the Palais Garnier. She looked breathtaking. She wasn't wearing the armor of the power suit she had worn to destroy his company, nor the terrifying midnight gown of the summit. She wore a soft, cream-colored dress that moved with the wind. She looked lighter, but she wasn't alone. Lady Wellingham confirmed this morning her engagement to Henri, the Duke of Savoy. The reporter continued. The couple announced a joint venture to fund sustainable energy grids across developing nations. Sources close to the couple say the wedding will be a private affair in Tuscany next month. The camera zoomed in. Clara was laughing. It wasn't a polite boardroom smile. It was a genuine head-thrown-back laugh at something the Duke had whispered to her. The Duke, a tall man with kind eyes and grey temples, looked at her with absolute adoration. He held her hand firmly, protectively, as they entered a waiting car. "Wow," Marco said, leaning on the counter next to Grant. "That lady is loaded. Isn't she the one who owns that big bank?" "She's beautiful." "She is," Grant said softly. "I heard she used to be married to some American tech guy." Marco continued, oblivious. "Some idiot who cheated on her and lost everything. Can you imagine fumbling a woman like that? Guy must be the biggest loser on the planet." Grant didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He stared at the screen as the car drove away, and the news segment ended. "Yeah," Grant said, picking up his rag. "He was. He was a complete fool." "Wonder what happened to him," Marco mused, going back to the register. Grant looked out the window of the coffee shop. The rain had started to fall, blurring the grey streets of Queens. "I think," Grant said more to himself than to Marco, "he finally grew up." That evening after closing, Grant walked home. He stopped at a bodega and bought a sandwich and a bottle of water. He walked past a newsstand. Clara's face was on the cover of Vanity Fair. The headline read, "The Quiet Power: How Clara Wellingham Redefined Success." Grant stopped. He reached into his pocket. He had $5 left for the day. He bought the magazine. He sat on a park bench under the yellow glow of a street lamp and opened the article. He read every word. He read about her childhood, her vision for the future, and her happiness. There was one quote near the end of the interview. The interviewer asked her about her past marriage. Interviewer: "Do you hold any resentment toward your ex-husband? The founder of Sterling Dynamics, Clara, resentment is a poison you drink hoping the other person will die. I don't drink poison anymore. I am grateful for that marriage. It taught me my own strength, and I hope wherever he is, he has learned that money is the least interesting thing a person can offer." Grant closed the magazine. He sat there for a long time, the sounds of the city washing over him. He thought about the penthouse he used to own. He thought about the private jets. He thought about the nights he spent checking stock prices instead of holding his wife. Then he thought about the coffee shop. He thought about the law student's smile when he gave her the latte. He thought about the fact that for the first time in 10 years, he slept through the night without medication. He stood up. He left the magazine on the bench for someone else to find. He walked the rest of the way home. It was raining, but he didn't run. He walked with his head up. Grant Sterling had lost the world. But as he turned the key to his small, empty apartment, he realized he had gained something far more valuable. He was finally free, too. It's easy to hate Grant Sterling at the beginning. He was arrogant, cruel, and blind to the treasure he had right in front of him. But in the end, life has a way of humbling all of us. Grant had to lose the glass castle to find the ground beneath his feet. Clara didn't just sign the divorce papers. She signed a Declaration of Independence. She proved that the best revenge isn't screaming or fighting, it's living well, succeeding on your own terms, and finding someone who truly knows your worth. This story asks a hard question. What are you taking for granted today? Is it a person, a job, a family member who supports you quietly from the shadows? Because, as Grant learned, the things we ignore are often the things that hold us up, and once they're gone, no amount of money can buy them back. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications. I have an even crazier story coming next week about a billionaire who left his fortune to his cat and the family war that followed. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching.